Good afternoon, everybody. If you happen to be in Sydney and if you happen to be elsewhere, whatever the time is there, good morning, afternoon, or evening to you. My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the original owners of the land on which this university, and indeed most universities, are based. In our case, this land was never ceded nor purchased in any way and belongs to its original owners who are responsible for land, water and air. We acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging. In our case, those people are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Today we're going to look at things Tibetan in the People's Republic of China. I'm going to hand over in a minute to Ryan Schramm, who's a well-known cultural anthropologist. I think it would be fair to say, though, that China is probably a little new to him, but we're always happy to bring in people and help them understand why they need to understand China, as well as Papua New Guinea. He will introduce our speakers today, and I'll hand over now to Ryan. Ryan.
Thanks, David. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm very happy to introduce our speakers today, Gerard Roche of La Trobe University and Shannon Ward of the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, each of whose work addresses the vexed status of linguistic diversity in contemporary Tibet. I spent a little time getting to know their recent work, and as I was learning about their recent work, I couldn't help but think about a possible comparison between Papua New Guinea, where I've carried out research, and the Tibetan Plateau. They're both very different, but in both places one finds borderland zones in which for centuries people have lived enmeshed in intensely heteroglossic environments. And then only very late in the 20th century, each of which were suddenly subject to state power, whose object was, in many ways, to rationalize that diversity. In the Amdo region of Tibet, and in many parts of PNG, and in many other parts of the world, we're accustomed to hearing about endangered languages, dying languages, languages going extinct. But for Roche and Ward, we should learn to see each of these situations as cases of language oppression, the systematic enforcement of language loss. And that's particularly true in the Amdo region of Tibet. Roche has explored that perspective throughout his work on Manegacha speakers, including in papers in China Quarterly, Modern Asian Studies, Language and Communication, and many other journals. Also in a review in Annual Reviews in Anthropology, and in his recent book, The Politics of Language Oppression in Tibet, which was published last year by Cornell University Press. Ward's work complements this focus with her ethnographic studies of how multilingual speakers, particularly children of minority languages, operate in the Amdo region's linguistic landscape. She's published this work in a variety of journals as well, including Language and Communication, Medical Anthropology Quarterly, Pragmatics, and in her most recent book entitled Amdo Lullaby, an ethnography of childhood and language shift on the Tibetan Plateau, which was published by University of Toronto Press. Today, the speakers will each present the findings of these monographs, so please join me in welcoming them. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the findings from Amdo Lullaby. So this book is the culmination of over a decade of research in Tibetan communities. And basically what I want to talk about is the ways that young children are actually driving change in the region of Amdo by recreating cultural connections between place and language. So even when it seems like they're giving up their mother tongues for more dominant languages, they're actually drawing on cultural knowledge about the links between language and place. And while the research that I conducted in this region focused on a particular period in contemporary Amdo, the ways that children drive language change through outmigration is a broader pattern that we see across Tibetan cultural worlds. So I'll first talk a little bit about the background of the ethnographic study and the field sites, And then I want to present field material briefly for you in two parts. I'll look at the intersections between land and language, and then between language and kinship in Amdo. And finally, I'll discuss some of the consequences of rural to urban migration in this region, which is reformatting associations between language, place, and kinship. So the map that I've chosen here shows Greater Cultural Tibet, and you can see in it Amdo, which is one of the three traditional provinces of Tibet. And today, Amdo is incorporated into mainland China's provinces of Qinghai, Sichuan, and Gansu. But Amdo represents the historical meeting point of Tibetan, Chinese, Hui Muslim, and Mongolian communities. And Amdo Lullaby is drawing on comparative ethnographic and linguistic research, which I conducted in Xining City, which is the capital of Qinghai province, as well as a village in rural Amdo, which I call Tachen, and the approximate locations are provided here. Tachen is located about 250 kilometers southwest of Xining in Tolo Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture, and this is an administrative unit with autonomous status in Qinghai. Between 2016 and 2018, I conducted 15 months of field research with one extended family, some of whom were living in the rural village and some of whom had moved to the provincial capital city. And these two field sites of Xining City and Tachen Village provide a lens into the ethno-linguistic diversity of Tibet more broadly. So linguists generally consider Tibetan to be a language family with anywhere from 38 to 54 documented languages that are historically related to each other. And Tibetans often refer to these as mother tongues or yulke, which are basically topolecs. So they mean a variety of a single language that's particular to a specific location. And in Tibetan cultural worlds, these are oftentimes conceptualized as making up a single Tibetan language that's differentiated into Böke, or spoken Tibetan, and Buyik, or written Tibetan. But linguists recognize Amdo Tibetan basically as a mutually unintelligible language with about 1.8 million native speakers. And we differentiate Amdo into two major varieties, Ronke, or farmer talk, which was the subject of this study, as well as Joke, or nomad talk. And Ronke, or farmer talk, shows more extensive internal diversity due to long-term contact with non-Tibetan communities. So the label Ronke actually encompasses multiple yulke, or multiple topolecs. And this map here shows the approximate range of Ronke and Joke in Amdo. Amdo is also home to diverse non-Tibetan peoples. So China's official census categories record 37 Minzu, or minoritized nationalities or ethnic minorities, just within Qinghai province alone. So while Tibetan languages have changed historically, today the major sociological factors that are shaping language change in Amdo have to do with rural to urban migration, which is basically intertwined with state efforts for territorial control. So my book approaches the current politics of China-Tibet relations as an example of settler colonization, which is realized through two primary components. The first is the eradication of Buddhist governance, and the second is development campaigns. So development is changing the livelihoods of rural Tibetans. It's making market employment more enticing, and these factors are driving many people to move to cities like Xining. And the image here on the right shows Xi Jinping in Ningxi, Tibetan, part of the Tibet Autonomous Region, providing one example of how development is framed as a gift by the Chinese state. As you'll learn about in the book as well, child development is actually figuring in an important way into these economic development campaigns. So access to formal education is a major factor that the state uses to justify rural development initiatives, and also that's driving urban migration. So increasingly, Tibetan families in Amdo are seeking out formal education, including education in Mandarin, as a pathway towards inclusion in a modernizing China. And there are two policies related to education that have been primarily associated with economic development in the region. The first is the enforcement of compulsory primary education. And this dates only to about the 2010s in Amdo, Qinghai. And the second is the school consolidation policy that started in 2008. And this involved closing rural Tibetan Mandarin bilingual primary schools and instead creating village-based preschools, but moving all other education to larger boarding schools in county seats. So while this means there's relatively more access to early childhood education in some villages, children need to leave their villages to begin primary school in grade 1. And oftentimes this drives the migration of entire families. So families who want to be closer to their children to support them will move temporarily to the county seat, and many more are actually seeking to move permanently to cities. And in these cities, their children can access day schools as opposed to boarding schools, but they can only access education in Mandarin. So in this setting, Amdo Lullaby asks two broad questions regarding children's creation of social and cultural worlds through language. So it asks, how do young children form identities as speakers or non-speakers of their mother tongues? And how does the dialogic emergence of social relationships in everyday talk influence the vitality of diverse Yulke or Amdo Tibetan children's mother tongues? And as the book seeks to show, even very young children are making choices that contribute to the creation of Tibetan cultural worlds, and these choices respond to political ideologies that we often think of as being restricted to adults. So the first ideology explicitly associates language variation with places. So the first part of field material I want to present deals with land and language. So there's a really famous Tibetan proverb many people have heard, Yulsa rere tsangchuyo, dewa rere geyo. Every valley has a river, every village has a language. And so we can see this proverb is even echoed in the ethnonym for diverse mother tongues, Yulke, or land speech. Young Amdo children actually show knowledge of the ways that their mother tongues mark place-based identity in their play. So during my fieldwork, a really frequent game that children played was called Joa, or traveling, and they would imaginatively travel to different places within Tibet, and they would call out the names of the places they wish to travel using pronunciations that were stereotypical of people from these regions. So they would say Lhasa with an exaggerated pitch contour and Goloch with harsher fricative consonants. And so what was interesting is that the children did not openly remark upon the unique features of their own Yulke, which also shows evidence of convergence with Salar, a Turkic language spoken by another minoritized community in Hualong County of Northeast Sachsen. And the extended family I did research in had actually migrated from Hualong to Sachsen 3 generations earlier. And some of the features that of the Yulke that show its contact with Salar include sentence final particles. And we can see some children using these sentence final particles here. So I'm going to tell a story about one evening when these two girls, Lamo and Dolma, sat with their uncle Akanorbu and asked him to help them travel. So using the Yulke, Lamo here suggested, Takidoba, let's travel by horse. And she encouraged Akanorbu to gallop his legs. And Akanorbo responded by commenting on Lamo's use of the Yulke sentence final particle. He said, Baba mase, chojarewa. Don't say Baba. Are you Chinese? So here, Akanorbu was identifying this feature of their mother tongue not as Tibetan, but as Chinese. So the sentence final particles are not often used in written Tibetan or more standard varieties of Amdo, but here, Akanorbu was actually suggesting it was borrowed from Mandarin. But a few moments later, Akanorbu himself used an obvious Mandarin loanword. He said, Takimanjo, Chukijo. Don't go by horse, let's go by car. So here the word for car was actually spoken in Mandarin. So what this example shows us is that features of the Yulke are actually being interpreted as Chinese, but only some people's language use is being scrutinized for non-native features, and that's children's language use. So in Amdo, these different concerns about the loss of Tibetan to Mandarin is actually leading adults to reevaluate the meanings of place-based language variation, especially when these language varieties are spoken by children. So given the common narrative that young children are driving language shift to Mandarin, children's uses of the Yulke might actually be criticized. But when we look at the family's broader history, these features of the mother tongue, like Ba, were not actually borrowed from Mandarin, but originated from contact with the Salar language that's spoken in Hualong. And you can see the location of Hualong County here. So this extended family originally came from Hualong, where they shared patronage of a single lama and also participated in homage marriage practices. And until the 1930s, this community had lived as Rongmadrok, which means neither farmer nor nomad. So they herded several hundred yak and sheep, sometimes for months at a time, but they also had a year-round residence in Hualong. But in the late 1920s and 30s, much of Qinghai province, including Hualong, was under the rule of the Ma family. And this was a Hui Muslim militarist clan whose leader was named Ma Bufang. The monastery that this family patronized managed their relationship with the Ma family until the late 1930s, when the Ma family actually entered into Tibetan villages, decimated them, and forced many men into military service in the war against the encroaching communist army. And it was at this point that the family migrated. So Aka Norbu, who we just met in the traveling game, explained in an oral history about his great-grandfather's life. He said, "The Lama of our Tibetan people gave the village to Ma Bufang. My great-grandfather and his family left Hualong empty-handed. It was like having to seek refuge in another country because of warfare. They had no house, they had no animals, they couldn't return to their own homeland. After my family escaped, Ma Bufang let the Hui people settle in the deserted land." So eventually, the family settled in Sachen village, and they built a new life for themselves, working as farmers and giving up their nomadic practices. And they started to patronize the Hula, or land deities, in Sachen. So this shows one offering site at the Latse, or mountain peak. But what's really interesting is that throughout this migration, despite displacement, the extended family maintained its connections through shared practices of religion and kinship. So Lamo and Dolma's grandmother, Ai Kangmo, married into this family from another village due to common practices known as mibje, or person exchange, basically when marriages were arranged based on existing family ties. And Ai Kangmo emphasized these ties in her life story. So she explained that her parents initially didn't want her to marry into another village, but when a member of the extended family asked for her hand in marriage, she said, "Since our families had pinsid chewa, or a stronger relationship, my parents couldn't refuse. Because I was the youngest child, my parents wanted to keep me with them in their village. But because our families had dang che, or a very close relationship, and were engaged in mutual exchange, they had to give me up." So this broader migration history is important to contemporary children's lives because the patterns of settlement and migration actually created unique features of the children's mother tongues. Throughout this displacement, however, the mother tongue was still passed down between generations, and kinship was one of the factors that contributed to this linguistic continuity. But another Tibetan proverb states, Pama puchu chikla sona mintak kakak. So children of the same family each have a different destiny. Today, increasingly, families are raising children in urban centers away from the homeland. And unlike the earlier migration from Hualong to Sachen, which allowed for linguistic continuity, these new migration patterns are encouraging language shift from the Yulke to Mandarin because now children are growing up in Mandarin-dominant social environments. And in fact, the dynamics of language change are now influencing kinship. So Lamo and Dolma's grandmother, Ai Kangmo, also described some of the decisions of her relatives to move to Xining City so that their children could attend public day schools. And so Ai Kangmo explained their parents think they need to learn both Chinese and Tibetan so that they will have the knowledge and ability to go anywhere in society and do whatever they want. But their grandfather felt that when they were around 3 years old, we should have brought them to the homeland to study literary Tibetan. Otherwise, his children will know how to speak Tibetan, their children will know how to speak some Tibetan, but his great-grandchildren will never speak Tibetan. Although they will be Tibetan, they will not know the Tibetan language, just like non-Tibetan people. They will be just like Chinese people. So here, Ai Kangmo is suggesting that urban education in Mandarin provides children with more opportunities, but that this inevitably leads to the loss of the mother tongue. But why is it that this migration and not their earlier migration from Hualong to Tsachen is leading to language shift? And education is playing a major role here because it provides a setting where children form relationships outside of their immediate families. Young children in Tsachen attend school with their relatives and Tibetan peers. But when children in Xining City start to form friendships with their non-Tibetan peers in preschool, they oftentimes shift to Mandarin. And so I have an excerpt now called I Won't Go to the Homeland. And we see a 3-year-old named Sonam in Xining City expressing his belonging to the city. And you'll see him speak in Mandarin as well as Amdo Tibetan, and the Mandarin loanwords are depicted in red. Okay, so here, grandfather asks Sonam, "Oh, that's Tsachen Joji, will you go to Tsachen, the village homeland?" And Sonam uses the mother tongue to respond to his question, saying, "Tsachen Manjo, I won't go to the homeland." And grandfather tries to persuade him, saying, "Tsachen Dola akucho teki terokyo." If you go to Tsachen, all your playmates are there. Then Sonam says, "Ga, which?" So here Sonam is showing that he can speak the mother tongue, but the content of what he's saying rejects the homeland and his relatives there. And then he switches into Mandarin, the language of the city, to express his desire for an urban friend, which he calls his older brother. So after grandfather names Sonam's relatives in Tsachen, Sonam says in Mandarin, "Buya, wuya, wo guga. I don't want them, I want my older brother." And grandfather tries to persuade him, but Sonam won't listen. He repeats, "Buya, wuya, wo guga," and then he tries to silence his grandfather, yelling, "Chao sila," it's too loud. So here we can see how Sonam is demonstrating his identity as a city child who belongs with his urban friends instead of with his rural relatives. And even at the age of 3, he's not only reflecting, but actively reproducing ideas that value the city and that situate it as more modern and civilized than the village. So it also seems as if Sonam has a different destiny than his relatives Lamo and Dolma in Tsachen. So it seems that somehow natural, because he lives in a city, he's shifting to Mandarin and he's going to abandon the mother tongue. But increasingly, Tibetan people are making their homes in cities. So major metropolises around the world are home to many indigenous languages and endangered languages. This is true not just in the context of Tibet, but Chinese-controlled Tibet is faced with a particular set of challenges to urban linguistic diversity. So despite promises of economic development, discrimination and structural inequalities actually prevent sustained mobility for most Tibetans. So many Tibetans cannot actually move to cities in central China. They must kind of remain on the plateau, and they still are economically marginalized in relation to Han Chinese settlers, even in these cities. And urban Tibetans are also living in an environment that creates a reduced set of functions for the Tibetan mother tongue. So there's outright repression of language activism, and the definitions of bilingual education are constantly changing in line with political interests. So when children express their belonging to the city by identifying as speakers of Mandarin, It's because they don't yet have avenues to express urban belonging in their mother tongues. So children are responding to policies and ideologies that are threatening not only the mother tongue, but also their closest family relationships when they seem to reject their homeland and the culture. So ultimately, this book shows that linguistic discontinuity is accompanied by ruptures in kinship and social relationships. So the consequences of economic development for child development go beyond educational achievement to impact intergenerational social bonds in this region. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Shannon. We now turn to a presentation from Gerard Roche.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I just want to start out by giving my own acknowledgement of the country that I'm on. So I'm speaking to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I also want to acknowledge, given what we're talking about today, that like practically any place you step on the face of the earth, where I am is also the site of language struggle. So I'm talking to you from what is today the city of Melbourne. But it's also the site of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and the Bunurong languages. Both of those languages are currently being reconstructed and reclaimed and being brought back by the communities that use them. And in that regard, I also just want to acknowledge that specifically where I am today is the Bundoora campus of La Trobe University, which is where I work. And La Trobe University is named after Charles La Trobe. And when we talk about the Wurundjeri people not having ceded their lands and being dispossessed and so on, Charles La Trobe was one of the key people who did that. So Charles La Trobe was the chief British governing official in what became the state of Victoria during the peak period of colonization, settlement, dispossession, and genocide. So I think in the context of what's happening here politically right now, we have an ongoing truth-telling commission here in Victoria, which is leading up to a treaty process between the state of Victoria and the First Peoples, like the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong peoples. And it's my hope that in the process of that treaty and truth-telling that we're going to reconsider the appropriateness of using names like La Trobe for institutions like public universities and so on. So with those kind of prefatory comments aside, I want to say thanks to everyone who helped put the event together, particularly Ping, who's working behind the scenes and did a lot of email legwork to get us all in the same place at the same time, which is not necessarily a simple or straightforward thing to do for busy academics scattered around the world. I also want to thank David and Ryan for their introductions, Mark, who's going to give some comments at the end, and Shannon for her presentation as well. And I just would like to recommend Shannon's book to everyone. I think it's a really beautifully written book, very insightful. The analysis of it is quite sophisticated, elegant, nuanced. And I think what it really does very powerfully is take you into the everyday life of Tibetan people living on the Northeast Tibetan Plateau in contemporary China. And it shows you how they navigate their broad political predicament through everyday decisions that boil down to very minute distinctions, not just between which word to use with whom, but subtleties of pronunciation and so on. And it's a really beautiful book for that, for taking broad political structures and showing how they come out of people's mouths in their everyday lives. So very much recommend it to everyone who's in attendance. And yeah, so I'm going to talk off the cuff and sans PowerPoint. I'm going to give a kind of broad overview of some of the important background and broad themes of my book. I'm going to try and touch on four areas over the next 17 minutes or so. So I want to provide some further background on language and linguistic diversity in Tibet and talk a little bit about the specific community that I worked with for this book. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about pre-colonial multilingualism. So talk about how do people use language and think about language before the contemporary Chinese state set itself up on Tibetan lands. The third one that I'm going to talk about is state building processes. So looking at what the state has done institutionally, economically, and politically in this particular corner of Tibet where I worked since the mid-20th century or so. And then I will move on finally to talk about issues of everyday discrimination that the community that I worked with face in their day-to-day lives. So that's a broad overview of what I'm going to be talking about. And I just went to switch my PowerPoint slide and I don't have one. So first of all, I'm going to talk about linguistic diversity in Tibet. So Shannon provided us with a really good foundation to start talking about this topic with the idea that Tibetan is a language family. So we have a written Tibetan language, a family of spoken languages, which have some kind of historical connection to that written language, and that historical connection is recognized by the speakers in that they sort of equate the spoken and written language as not the same thing, but as being connected in some way. In addition to that written language and family of languages, we also have another cluster of languages that I call the minority languages of Tibet. So these languages, they are very distinct from that family of Tibetan languages. If we want a kind of an analogy that we could pin it on, it would be similar to, say, the difference between English and Mandarin Chinese, right? They're very distinct linguistically, and the speakers of those languages and other Tibetans acknowledge that distinctness in those languages. So there are debates about how those languages should be counted, classified, and so on. I think probably the best estimate would be that there's maybe around 30 of those languages, but ultimately the decision about how many languages there are should be up to the people who speak those languages. However, the political context that exists inside China does not allow those people access to the political institutions that make those decisions. So we can't rely on estimates coming from within China, from the people themselves, because they are politically prevented from making those decisions. So we have to look to the linguistics literature, we have to look for on-the-ground practices, but we can't look for sort of institutional measurements, census data, and things like that for that information. So around 30 languages. In terms of the number of people who speak these minority languages, best estimate, and again, it's an estimate, is around 250,000 people, which represents approximately 4% of the total Tibetan population. So I worked closely in this book with a community on the Northeast Tibetan Plateau in what is today Qinghai province. It's in the traditional Tibetan region of Amdo. And this community speaks a language that they call Manegacha. Manegacha in that language simply means our language. And this is quite a common situation. Language names really only emerge as an apparatus of kind of state classification and management. So in most of the places where you go, if you ask people what the name of their language is, that's a question which doesn't necessarily make sense. And that's certainly true across much of Tibet today. They will just say something like our language or the language of this particular place. So Manegacha is spoken by about 8,000 people in 4 villages in a single valley called Rebgong. And historically, the language came to that region about 700 years ago. It's a Mongolic language, so it's related to forms of Mongolian, but it's been heavily influenced by the local Tibetan variety, and people recognize that, and it's significant in a way that I'm going to come back to later on. Manegacha is what is often described as an endangered language. So that means that the number of speakers of this language is declining, and the language is also experiencing a decline in intergenerational transmission. So what that simply means is that fewer and fewer people are transmitting the language across generations to their children or to their grandchildren, as it may be. And Manegacha is not alone in this situation amongst the minority languages of Tibet. So from the information that we have from a variety of sources, which I'll say a little bit about in a second, we know that all of the minority languages of Tibet are experiencing a very rapid collapse of intergenerational transmission at the moment. And that's kind of the result of pressures that I'll describe shortly that have been building up over the course of decades. And we see these flips happening in a lot of communities where an entire community will make a collective decision to stop transmitting the language to all the children in the village. This is what has happened in one of the villages where Manegacha is spoken. So you've got 4 villages and one of them suddenly stops transmitting the language. And then in all 3 other villages, a couple of families have decided on their own to stop transmitting the language. So on the whole, amongst the 4 villages, about a third of the households have ceased transmitting the language. And if this trend continues, and we have no reason to think that it won't at the moment, if this trend continues, that language will eventually stop being spoken in those communities. And in the specific case of Manegacha, the language that is being transmitted in place of that language is the local variety of Tibetan. That's not the case for many of the communities that speak these minority languages across Tibet. About a third of them, just under a third of them, are switching to some form of Tibetan. The other 2/3 are switching to some form of Chinese, but universally, all those languages are collapsing in intergenerational transmission at the moment. So let me sort of paint a broad historical picture of how we got to this situation by starting with pre-colonial multilingualism in the Manegacha speaking community. So just a note on that word pre-colonial, what I mean by it, it's a slightly misleading term in this case. Colonialism on the Northeast Tibetan Plateau by the precursors of the modern Chinese state dates back to the early 1700s. So 1723, 1724, that part of Amdo was incorporated into the Qing dynasty and its broad imperial territories. However, the Qing dynasty ruled that area very much from afar and with a very light touch on people's day-to-day life. And so I talk about, in the book, a term taken from the study of Chinese communal religion and political anthropology as well, which describes the political life of those communities as autarky, which essentially means self-rule. So the communities were self-governing in basically every significant aspect of their daily life, including in relation to language. And what that self-governance of language looked like in those communities was that everyone spoke Manegacha to each other pretty much most of the time. But there was also the presence of various forms of Tibetan. And so there were I would describe at least 3 various forms of Tibetan which were present in the community. So first, the written Tibetan language was present in everyone's life as scripture. People had sacred Tibetan texts in their household. They had them in the local monastery. These texts were recited. I call them in the book sound objects in the same way that books are a physical object. And this was part of daily life. It was part of the significant cycle of rituals throughout the year. And everyone would have had some familiarity visually and sonically with that type of Tibetan. Tibetan also functioned in those communities and indeed across the rest of Tibet as what I call a lingua franca. So as opposed to a lingua franca, which is a commonly spoken language, Tibetan operated as a lingua franca. So even in communities where few or no people spoke Tibetan as their first or preferred language, most adults could sing in Tibetan right across Tibet, and they would use that as a medium of interaction and communication and exchange with other Tibetan communities, particularly in specific intercommunal gatherings, but also in sort of ad hoc social interactions outside the village space. So Manegacha speakers in pre-colonial era sang in Tibetan as well as reciting it as a sacred scripture. And then finally, they also had some interactions with Tibetan speakers on and off throughout the year through sort of minor labor exchanges where people would go to each other's communities to help out with work such as harvesting and threshing and so on. People intermarried between the communities. And there was a pattern of language shift that occurred where women married into their husbands' villages, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly. And when a woman married into a new community, if they spoke a different language, she was expected to acquire that language within a few years and then pass the community's language onto her children. And the children would have an understanding of her family language, but usually would not be able to produce it. So in pre-colonial Tibet, that's kind of the broad picture of multilingualism. And this was a sustainable pattern of multilingualism. So if you recall that I said that this language first appeared in the community of Rebgong around 700 years ago, this pattern of multilingualism was sustainable to that extent that the language was passed down generation to generation for those many centuries. And that all changed rapidly from the mid-20th century onwards. So I'm going to try and like squeeze the last two bits together to keep on time. But there was when the Chinese state firmly established itself on the Northeast Tibetan Plateau in 1949, it kind of held back for a little while, did not really interfere in people's daily lives in any significant way until 1958. There was a land collectivization program, which the local population responded to with an uprising, an armed uprising. There was an armed uprising across Amdo against the more stringent and invasive imposition of the state into people's daily lives. And the state cracked down on that with extreme violence. So there was mass incarceration of people who were involved or suspected of being involved. Thousands of people were killed, and all public political infrastructure was destroyed, both physical and social. So you had religious figures either being killed or locked up. You had religious institutions being either demolished or emptied of their contents and used for profane purposes, and so on. And so the state after 1958 really began to invade and encroach on people's everyday lives and completely destroyed that prior autarky that had existed. The state's treatment of local populations goes through a couple of different phases over the ensuing decades. There's the collectivization period up until the 1980s. And during that period, there was very little schooling, no media, etc. What there was the state was present in villages every day through these compulsory political meetings, which everyone had to attend, and to receive indoctrination from the state in Tibetan. So rather than Manegacha, rather than Chinese, Manegacha villagers had to sit and listen to these political indoctrinations every day. This did not really impact people's language practices in profound ways at the time. From the 1980s onwards, there's an economic opening. Tibetans are forced into the labor market because they now have to earn cash to survive and meet their needs every day. This has profound impacts on people's language behaviors because they're forced into a labor market which is dominated by Mandarin Chinese and other languages, which they have to start using. Again, there's another shift when we get into the 21st century, which Shannon was talking about, where compulsory education becomes a driver of the state. And for the first time in history, you have all Tibetan people forced into the school system. And the school system in Rebgong is primarily a Tibetan medium. There is also a Chinese medium school. If you're a Manegacha speaker, you have to choose between one of those two. You cannot go to school in Manegacha. So today in Tibet, if you're a Manegacha speaker, you cannot go to school in your language. You cannot pick up a book in your language. You cannot watch TV in a language. You cannot visit a doctor in your language. You might be able to use social media in your language, but not a lot. Manegacha speakers today are forced into a situation where primarily if they want their children to have a good life, they are forced to decide whether they want to transmit Tibetan to them or to transmit Mandarin Chinese to them. To transmit Manegacha is to limit their life opportunities. And I won't have time to go into detail about this, but I'm happy to answer questions about this. Transmitting Manegacha to one's children and grandchildren in the local context in Phrebgong is also to expose them to a really just punishing grind of everyday discrimination from local Tibetan populations who see Manegacha as an inferior language, as a mixed language. And they've also increasingly come to see the Manegacha language as a threat to Tibetans' collective identity. So as the Chinese state's assimilatory pressures on Tibetans have increased, there's been heightened fears of language mixing and language shift amongst Tibetans. And Manegacha speakers have come to represent that for local Tibetans. So one anecdote that I collected amongst many describes a group of Manegacha speakers who went to a Tibetan place to undertake some migrant labor, and they were hanging around in the street talking to each other. And a monk stopped by and said to them, you know, you people should be careful. If you keep speaking like that, you're all going to turn into Chinese. And for us, Tibetan speakers, if we're not careful, we're all going to end up speaking like you. So there's this idea that there's a spectrum of degradation from like a pure Tibetan to mixed languages like Manegacha and other minority languages to Chinese. And so when Tibetans feel threatened by assimilation by the Chinese state, their language ideologies and state behaviors position Manegacha speakers and other Tibetans as part of that collective threat to Tibetan identity and their capacity to live in the future as Tibetan people. So I will break it off there, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gerald, and thank you to both of our speakers. In my haste to introduce both of these presentations, I overlooked introducing Mark Post, who is today's discussant. Mark comes to us from the University of Sydney Department of Linguistics and is, I think, well known to both of these speakers, and whose work deals directly with many of the issues we've been talking about today. He's focused mainly on Asian minority languages and their sociocultural contexts. He's written over 10 books, which include comprehensive grammatical and historical linguistic descriptions, particularly of the languages Galo and Tangam, which are minority languages in another region nearby in the Eastern Tibet border region. He is also, in addition to being a senior lecturer here in our linguistics department, also the co-director of the Center for Cultural Linguistic Diversity with Yankee Modi, who I happen to notice happens to be here today as well, too. This is a training and resourcing organization engaging indigenous researchers and community organizations throughout the region that we're hearing about today. So thank you very much, Mark, for coming to act as our discussant, please.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Ryan. No problem for introducing me sooner. Yeah, I think I have about 15 minutes. I'll take probably about just slightly less than half of it to sort of reflect on both of these books and in part as they're presented here today, but then sort of open it up to some larger themes and ask our speakers some questions about these issues. So these are both very important books, talking about a very important topic, as Ryan's already mentioned. So there's 420 language families that are known to have existed, and presumably more have in deep time. Of those, 100 are now extinct. That's 24%. And importantly, the majority of those have gone extinct since the 1960s. Of the 639 languages that Lyle Campbell in 2013 identified as known to have gone extinct within the historical period, 227 of them have become extinct since 1960. So this means the extinction of human language is now accelerating. So, depending on how you want to view things through what sort of a lens, it seems that on average, one human language becomes extinct every 3 months, such that about half or slightly under half of the languages, the 7,000 plus languages spoken in the world today are thought to now be endangered in some sense. So if we, not to belittle mammals or avian species by any means, but if we compare that to mammalian species, the figures closer to 7%, avian species closer to 3%. So again, that's a tremendous crisis. But when we're talking about half of the world's linguistic diversity, that's a crisis of extraordinary proportions. So these books address some of the reasons why this state of affairs is the way it is. So Shannon Ward's book is a critical ethnography based on both fieldwork and analysis of transcribed spoken texts, quite meticulously transcribed and interlinearized. So it focuses on a few years in the language development of children in Amdo Tibetan family in what's now today Qinghai province of China. So she compares the experiences of children raised in a rural village where what I understand she describes as Amdo Tibetan farmer talk. I can't pronounce it in the orthography used, so just continue to use the term farmer talk is spoken, with those raised in urban areas where Mandarin predominates. So unsurprisingly, village children have more chances to learn Amdo vernacular farmer talk. But both groups nevertheless become multilingual, and Ward argues that this overlooked multilingualism is in fact a core feature of Amdo Tibetan identity. But of course, there's multilingualism and there's multilingualism. So as Ward shows, village children can purposefully switch between dialects in part of their play to enact the voices of different characters, different sorts of roles, different people that exist in their society with different backgrounds. So that's sort of quite what I think we might call virtuosic code switching. But there's also cases in which there's sort of imperfect language learning, perhaps at the heart of it, or acquiescence to a dominant code in an urban setting, where vernacular language might be felt as having lost its utility or social relevance. So given these sorts of conditions, you might wonder if it's even possible to maintain Amdo Tibetan vernacular outside of its traditional context. So adults respond to this change in two ways. They might tacitly accept Mandarin's dominance, seeing it as a path to social, I suppose, socioeconomic mobility, advancement. But they also resist it by promoting written Tibetan, or at least conservative varieties of Tibetan, even though it seems tied to the very state policies that are viewed as marginalizing Amdo Tibetan itself. So paradoxically, these adults are promoting a sort of linguistic purism, sort of valorizing conservative forms of Tibetan over the mixed language practices of children. The author identifies cases of parents scolding children for their tendency to code switch, describing it as sort of shaming them. Probably reasonably reflects the experience of children. I've certainly seen my share of that in different contexts. But it might also, without wanting to sort of belittle or cast out on that point, be more charitably described from their parents' perspectives as something more akin to anxiety or despair. So to turn to the role of the state now, and while Ward makes it clear that the Chinese state plays a role in marginalizing Amdo Tibetan, and that's a point which Roche makes much more forcefully in his book, the PRC did at the same time not create the ideology of linguistic dominance in this region, right? So historically, Wutsang Tibetan and its cultural authority quite significantly predate the PRC or even the Qing Empire for that matter, with its roots in the Tibetan Empire's expansion itself. So these sorts of chauvinistic attitudes that exist in relation to minority languages are thus unlikely to have arisen overnight, but more probably have roots in this pre-PRC period, which sort of raises the question, this is a question I ask, of whether it's useful to view modern Chinese colonialism as the primary causal factor in Amdo Tibetan's marginalization, as the power dynamics among different Tibetan-speaking groups, say nothing of non-Tibetan minorities in Tibet, seem quite clearly to have existed long before the involvement of what's today the modern Chinese state. So moving more explicitly to Gerard Roche's book, which I have to confess I read the first four and chapters of, and then the last chapter. I couldn't manage to make a couple there in the middle. Roche nonetheless presents a great deal of evidence to show how the Chinese state's neglect of minority languages, such as Manegacha, contributes to language shift. So he argues that state policies effectively erase these languages. And like Ward, he points out that the Tibetan resistance also fails to challenge this linguistic erasure, at least it fails to effectively challenge it, instead promoting this sort of unified vision of Tibet with a single language and ignoring the region's present and historical linguistic diversity. So importantly, he also shows, sort of doesn't shy away from showing, I might say, how Manegacha speakers face discrimination from what, I don't know, I might call ethno-linguistically pure Tibetans, which is a situation that is certainly rooted in centuries of inequality dating back to the Tibetan Empire. So the Chinese state certainly exacerbates these inequalities, but I don't think it would be fair, and I'm not suggesting that this is being said, but it wouldn't be fair to say that they created them. Marginalization of this scale has deep historical roots. And although it's important to bring the role of the state to the center when asking what to do about this, I think placing too much emphasis on the state risks oversimplifying the history of linguistic and cultural power imbalances that exist in this region if we're not careful. So I'll finish up soon, but I wanted to sort of illustrate this point by briefly comparing this situation to a slightly different one, not far away as the crow flies, but politically within India, the situation of the Milang people in northeastern India, which is the tribe to which Yankee Modi belongs. And I trust that she'll correct me if I say anything unsafe about the situation there. So the Milang live in a multi-ethnic and multilingual region at the center of what Yankees called the onion of colonization. So at the core of the onion is linguistic differences and power imbalances among different Milang villages and even clanlets, to which children naturally converge despite the absence of a Milang state or any sort of hierarchical power structure that formally exists within that society. So the Milang are then surrounded by other groups like the Adi, whose language has been imposed on the Milang for centuries. And moving outward, layers of colonization have been added by historical states such as the Kachari Kingdom, the Shantaya home, and probably, although this is hard to demonstrate, but probably an unknown Austroasiatic language, which has left its traces on the languages in this region. It's probably quite influential at one time. So moving further outward, we find the historical Tibetan state, which barely reached so far as the Milang, but which imposed its language on cognate groups such as the Tangam, Bori, and Bokar, who continue to tolerate settlement by Tibetan refugees in their traditional lands to this day. More recently, we find the imposition of Indian languages, first Assamese and later Hindi, while English sort of encloses Milang at the outer layer of the onion as the sort of colonizing language par excellence on a global scale. But I think this broader historical and sociocultural perspective maybe challenges the binary of colonizer versus colonized. The former being used largely as a term of abuse, I think, in modern academic discourse, which sometimes has the effect of obscuring rather than illuminating the historical dynamics of language shift. Linguistic diversity is now, and it's always been, under threat, but the difference today is these effects are more pronounced, or they're taking place more rapidly due to the extraordinary political and informational and social reach that most nation states have today. But linguistic hegemony has not been experienced everywhere across all time as a state effect. And it may not be the sole or even best explanatory factor for linguistic marginalization as it exists in many places today, which often have deeper historical roots. So instead, I'd like to sort of shift focus, if I could, and ask a question under the assumption that most of us will continue to live in nation states for the foreseeable future. We might ask what strategies can preserve linguistic diversity in today's globalized state-centric world. So Ward and Roche both show that linguistic diversity exists at every level: district, village, clan, and even individual. So does the responsibility to protect this diversity lie solely with the state? And if so, what sorts of policies might help to sustain it in China or in any nation in the world? What responsibilities can be assigned to communities themselves, and what can we as global citizens do about it, either in our own communities or in others? So I've my own thoughts on this, but I'd like to hear from our speakers now, if I could. What should be done? I'm done, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much, Mark. And I do want to give the speakers a chance to respond. So thanks for that opening. But before we jump to that, I do need to do a little bit of housekeeping. As everybody attending will have seen in the chat box in a message from Ping, when you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. You can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen that there's an icon marked Q&A. At least that's what I can see on mine. And that should allow you to type in a question rather than using the chat or using the reaction icons or something like that. Thanks very much. Now, Mark, you posed a question to our speakers, so I'll give them the floor.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll respond a little bit. And I think just in regards to the first question about maybe overstating the influence of the state, I mean, I think at least with my ethnography, the thing that is different about the forms of migration that are happening in like language context that's happening now is really like the education system in the lives of young children. And so when we see formal education, that's like one of the key factors, especially residential education, right, that contributes to rapid language endangerment. And so from my perspective, it's not that complicated to say the state is really involved in the rapidity of language endangerment that we see kind of right now within these communities in Tibet, just because of the education system and the role that that can play in interrupting intergenerational transmission. But in terms of if it's possible, like what are the possibilities for language vitality? I mean, in some of my other research, also with diasporic communities, I've really come to believe that if you have like even one relationship that you use a language in, that language can be sustained. And so I think that there are possibilities, but people have to basically expand the functions, right? Expand the potential functions of the language. But the way to do that is first and foremost through relationships. And I guess I'll turn it over to Gerald now.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon, and thanks for the comments and the question, Mark. I will try to avoid giving another 20-minute lecture on this topic, but it's something that I've thought for a long time about, I suppose. So the analysis that I present in the book very much points the finger at the contemporary Chinese state, and does so with a deliberate lack of nuance and subtlety. And I think that it's important to do that. So there's a couple of reasons for that. I want to go back to where you started, talking about this global crisis of linguistic diversity that we have. And this absolutely massive and historically unprecedented destruction of linguistic diversity that we are living through at the moment. And I do think destruction is the correct word for that. You know, this is happening everywhere in the world. I started off my talk with reference to the Woiwurrung and Bunurong languages, which are spoken here. I spent time living in Sweden, where you have the indigenous Sami languages. I've worked with people in India, Bhutan, Philippines, etc., etc. The literature is full of examples. And any country on earth that you look at is almost certainly going to be home to endangered languages. And this means that we have to transcend the local context of any given place to look at the world system to understand what is happening in any given place. And if we look at the world system, like what exists that spans the entire globe that can bring about these kind of profound changes in people's everyday lives and in their capacity to live as a community? Well, there's two things I would say. And I would sort of nestle a bunch of other things under these. But one is capitalism as a world-spanning system that was propagated across the globe through practices of colonialism. And the other one is the contemporary nation state system, which similarly piggybacked off colonialism. And, you know, I would sort of say that if you want to think about the root causes of language endangerment, wherever you are, capitalism and the nation state have a hefty role to play. And whichever one you emphasize might be a matter of political commitment, your specific analysis, the precise situation, and so on and so on. I think it's important to emphasize the state because the state has the capacity to unleash the economy on populations. That's what we saw in China. Now, we have to complicate that a little bit because the liberalization of the Chinese economy came about as the result of sort of its entry into the global economy during the 1970s. Western powers invested heavily, their companies offshored everything to China. China became the factory of the world. The economy developed, that pleased the Chinese state no end, et cetera, et cetera. That all trickled down into Tibet, where you had this sort of economic tidal wave hit them across the 80s and 90s and into the early 21st century. That never would have happened if the state had not opened the door, right? That was the state's decision. The state controlled whatever happened in that territory. Now, you do have these important influences of prior political relations and hierarchical political relations. So there is absolutely a subtext of sort of Tibetan cultural chauvinism that makes a huge difference in the daily lives of Manegacha speakers, right? So they're seen, you know, there is these dichotomies of barbaric and civilized, pure and polluted, and so on, which are relevant to the Manegacha speaking context. The Tibetan culture doesn't have the capacity to call the police on you. The Chinese state does, right? We have to trace it back to who has access to legitimate use of violence. The Chinese state can make you disappear, can place your community under martial law, can enact censorship, can close down the protest, can bring the police, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is not whether there are other forces at work. The question is, how do all of those forces align to state power and its monopoly on violence? And so what I tried to do in the book is really trace back all the different contours of power which are relevant to see how they align with state power. So what I didn't talk about today, but I spend a whole chapter on in the book, is global networks of advocacy for Tibet. And I try and look at how they align with state power, because power operates without people necessarily having intentions about what they're doing, right? So this brings us to the question of what is to be done. And so, you know, the reason why I emphasize the state and its central role is because we have to influence state behavior in order for there to be a change in circumstances that will enable these languages to flourish. And that's true everywhere, right? And those changes can look discursive in the sense of talking more about diversity and so on. They can look institutional in terms of like building up more institutions to support those languages. But, you know, decolonization happened once before and it can happen again. We don't need to take the nation state in its current territorial form everywhere on the planet as a fixed, right? We just don't have to do that. And I think we need to imagine different possible futures to think about the way that things could be radically different, because they could be. So that's my broad general answer to the points that you raised and the question. In terms of what we should do, like solidarity is the thing I finished the book with. We should stand in solidarity with people who are facing state violence. We should provide avenues for that violence to be exposed and denounced, and we should use the outrage that generates to influence state behavior. And there are long traditions of activism that have done this successfully in other venues. So I think that there's good reason to hope that those methods will bring results.
Well, we already have one question from our Q&A box, so it suggests this function is working. I apologize in advance if I mispronounce anybody's names in the Q&A box, but we have a question from Jamie. The overall effect of linguistic purism ideologies among these minoritized languages, would you call it a positive or a negative for language maintenance? I suppose that's a question for both of you.
Well, in my book in chapter 4, I talk a bit about the negative consequences of it. I think in the context like this, where children are acquiring this as their first language still, it tends to just not be much positive, right? Because they already are being exposed to the language. And so they do have some grasp of it. I think in contexts where like you're seeing heritage language education, or maybe people are learning a language as a second language, there can be ways that purism maybe provides like an anchor for identity. But I think in the context where children are exposed to the language as their mother tongue, it mostly just prevents them from using the language in more functions.
Yeah, I'm pretty hard on language purism as a meaningful form of support for minoritized languages in general. I'll just offer what I think is the best defense of language purism that I've seen, where it's being called lexical self-determination. And I think that that's a nice way of thinking about it. That's kind of a framing which gives me pause for thought. It's essentially about the community exerting control over their language. However, in practice, in the context where I have seen it at work, it's really only been a force for harm. So I've written about this independently. It comes up in the book as well, but I have an article on this called Lexical Necropolitics, where basically I trace the relationship between linguistic purism and the destruction of collective identities, using Manegacha as a case study, where if you say pure languages are good, that creates a justification and a motivation for eradicating communities that are perceived as speaking mixed languages. So when people are thinking about which languages are mixed and which ones are pure, they're not sitting down and doing a lexical analysis and setting a bar and doing it like, it's not a statistical endeavor. It's based on fairly loose language ideologies and hunches that people have. And so in the case of Manegacha, people will say that it's a mixed language. Like Tibetan speakers will say that Manegacha is a mixed language because they can hear Tibetan loan words in it. And even though they can't understand what Manegacha speakers are saying, they will label that language as an impure form of Tibetan on the basis of those ideologies, and they will insist that those people speak pure Tibetan, which means to stop speaking Manegacha, and they will apply relentless pressure to them to do that. So I think like that's a particular, like perhaps an extreme case of the way that lexical purism, linguistic purism can harm people. But again, the broader literature on it also suggests that it tends to have generally negative impact, but I will keep a door open for lexical self-determination.
This has truly been a multilingual presentation. I'd like to ask all of the panelists to turn their attention to the current question in the Q&A box, because I believe that you guys are more able to read the name and properly credit this question. But it's a question for both of the speakers about both Manegacha and other minoritized languages on the Tibetan Plateau. Can you guys see the question? Comes to us from UBC, so it's probably also well known to everybody here as well too, but it's an excellent question. How many other languages like Manegacha are currently spoken on the Tibetan Plateau, and how much of their language is documented? Thank you for that question.
Maybe I'll take this, Shannon, if you want to jump in at the end. So these minority languages of Tibetan are typically not well described and documented, either in the linguistic literature or in the archives. So just to give an example of the kind, and that's a byproduct of the state's refusal to acknowledge that they exist, essentially. and the way that the communities have been shut off to researchers because of that. So to give an example of the kind of the state of research on these languages, I was putting together an article which just tried to provide a state-of-the-art report on the literature on the linguistic diversity in Tibet, focusing on minority languages. And while that article was going to press, the person that I was working with on that article was based in Norway. They were at a gathering of Tibetans in Norway as a linguist and speaking to people, and someone there said, "Oh, it's interesting that you're a linguist. You know, this guy over here speaks this language that no one can understand. You guys should have a chat." And then they got talking, and it turned out that the language that that person spoke was undocumented in the literature in any language. And when those two people started working together, they discovered that there was actually a cluster of languages which spoken in the Chamdo, around Chamdo inside the Tibet Autonomous Region, and none of them had been documented in the linguistics literature or any other literature for that matter. So like right up until a couple of years ago, languages were still being described and documented. And it's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the complexities of the socio-linguistic context, the nuances of the everyday politics of language in these different communities. We know very, very little at the moment. So hopefully that gives you some answer to your question.
Shannon, any further comments?
No, I mean, the only comment I would add is just, I think like there aren't many people either who have the opportunities to document them, especially now that fieldwork is becoming complicated. But there are some like doctoral students who are I know trying to break into that area as well.
Well, we can go a little bit over time in case there are other questions, but I actually had a question that sort of follows from this and several of the other comments. We've been talking a lot about, for lack of a better term, what we might call language death. What about language birth? It seems that one of the issues that we're dancing around here is that concepts of language death, while intuitive on one level, don't get me wrong, might also smuggle in a certain essentialist notion of languages as a named entity. At least that's where I'm feeling this out. Whereas there is another alternative position reflected in different ways in everybody's work so far, which is language is something you do. And so that's sort of what's behind my question. What about linguistic innovation? Has this come up in any of the research that's represented here today? And would anybody like to offer some examples?
So yeah, I mean, with kids, there's a lot of language innovation that happens, right? And I think what's really fascinating is some of the types of code mixing that kids do in these different settings. But what you see, like, so since I've been did this work in Amdo, now I'm located in Canada and I'm doing more research with the Tibetan diaspora in Canada. And you see a really different situation where the kids here, I would say, have less like knowledge of the formal grammar of Tibetan, but they do a lot more innovation compared to what I saw in Amdo. And I think some of the reasons for that are the ideologies and because I think in the situation in Amdo in particular, the repression of language difference really contributes to language death in ways that don't allow for a lot of the types of innovation that you see in other settings of migration and multilingualism. And I think that comes out quite clearly in some of the excerpts that I give, especially in chapter 4 about the standard language ideologies, just where children's language use is so scrutinized that it does become difficult for them to innovate in the ways that children intuitively do in other settings.
Yeah, Mark?
So I didn't want to interrupt you, Gerald. If I can address that, am I allowed to as a discussant? Well, so I might compare that, if I could, again, to biological species, because there's, of course, innovation in biological species as well. We have genetic mutations and selection. Everything's always evolving, but it evolves at a particular rate. And so a particular species of, well, let's say, a platypus or an echidna took however many millions of years to evolve to the point that it's at now. That species will continue to evolve, but at a very slow rate. So a language such as Basque, which is not known to be related to any other language in the world, is, well, there's an unknown degree of distance and time between that and what would have been its most recent ancestor with any other extant language. So we're talking about something that developed over millennia, certainly. So, any language is going to innovate and evolve, but it will not achieve the sort of scale of difference, distinctness, diversity factor, if you like, that gets achieved over 1,000 years in just a few years. So to relate that directly to this talk, one thing that I was very drawn to in Shannon's book was the discussion of deixis, because as she showed, there's a system of topographical deixis that operates in this language, in which it's not possible, well, shouldn't say it exactly that way, but the language strongly suggests that you should make a distinction between that up there, that down there, and that on the same topographical level. So I did a survey of this sort of a system in, well, a huge number of Tibeto-Burman languages, and found that this system has taken quite some time to evolve and get sustained in a large number of languages in the family. But when it gets lost in a single generation, and it does not come back. So we're talking here about the loss of systems which are quite distinct in the world and that take time to get to be the way that they are. Of course, innovations will happen, but they will not achieve the same levels of diversity that have been achieved over thousands of years through processes that unfold in a single individual's lifespan.
And if I can just jump in with my own quick answer. So thinking about the issues that you've just raised, like my guilty secret as someone who's published a book on language oppression is that I'm fundamentally more interested in people than I am in languages. And so what I'm interested in, what I'm looking for when I think about these issues is essentially the human relations that exist, and the human impacts that exist through these processes. So I think that decline in linguistic diversity, although I talk about it in numerical terms and so on, essentially what I think is problematic about it is that it's evidence of harmful, hierarchical, political relations. So when people are subjected to language oppression, it harms them in a number of ways. Psychologically, there are physical impacts on health and well-being. That is another topic for a conversation of a different day. It's harmful on an individual level, and it's unjust on a political level. So that's what I think about when I think about this issue. So even though there is creation, in Tibet, for example, you see emergence of new forms of Tibetan that are sort of more standardized, that are replacing these variety of the topolects that Shannon talked about. So there's creation of new diversity at the same time as there's destruction, but that diversity is being created through unjust and harmful political relations. On the topic of essentialism, again, I'll just try to keep it brief. Like one of the models that I draw on in my thinking about languages and are they things, are they constructs, is Charles W. Mills, who's a political philosopher, passed away, sadly, 2 years ago, I think it was. He has a fantastic book called Blackness Visible, where he's a philosopher of race and white supremacy as a political system. And I'm going to paraphrase him here. He says something to the effect of race is ontologically shallow, but intersubjectively deep, which is to say that race in itself doesn't exist, but the way that it's constructed and the way that that construct manifests in our social and political relations makes it absolutely real in a way that can impact people's life chances, physical health, etc. And the same goes for languages. we could argue endlessly about the fuzzy boundaries and fluctuating nature of language change and so on and so on. But when communities are targeted and attacked on the basis of the language that they speak, essentialism doesn't come into it. The essentialism is coming from the attackers, and we need to think about it through their lens if we want to understand those relationships and if we want to intervene in those relationships as well. So that's my take on those issues.
Thanks very much.